The withered bodies of 6 starving Jem'Hadar girls, crammed into a decrepit cargo hold and left for dead, shocked Captain Nolan Parker to his core. His aging freighter had docked at Krelix 7, a deteriorating space station orbiting a lifeless rock in a neglected galaxy sector, expecting to offload routine supplies and refuel. But as Nolan's first mate Ezra Hawkins pried open a rusted hatch in the bowels of the station, the grisly sight within the hidden chamber turned their mundane trading run into a moral crucible. Juno, the eldest girl at 13, summoned her last ounce of strength to reach a skeletal hand towards the human captain. Her desperate plea for salvation, barely audible over the wheeze of her atrophied lungs, ignited a firestorm in Nolan's conscience. The Jem'Hadar Empire, ruled by a rigid caste system and dystopian brutality, treated these orphan children as subhuman refuse. To interfere risked the wrath of a civilization that snuffed out entire worlds for far less. But Nolan was human, and no human worth the title could abandon innocent kids to a slow, agonizing demise, regardless of their species. Snarling a curse against the soulless ascendancy, the grizzled captain scooped Juno's frail body into his arms and barked at his crew to grab the rest. Alarms shrieked through the station as the humans carried their precious cargo back to the docking bay, sealing the airlock behind them with shaking hands. Nolan knew the instant the first drone swarm descended on their freighter that the Jem'Hadar would never let them reach free space alive. The monolithic empire dealt swiftly and brutally with any challenge to their absolute authority. Rescuing children consigned to death by their own government was the highest treason. But with 6 tiny flames of life flickering in his hold, Nolan had no choice but to roll the dice. "Full burn for the hyperlane," the captain roared, strapping into the pilot's chair and slamming the throttle to maximum. "And pray to whoever's listening we make the border before they catch us." The aging freighter groaned in protest as her overloaded engines hurled them into the void, gambling everything on a desperate race for sanctuary. Jem'Hadar warships screamed after them, hungry for blood and hell-bent on stamping out the embers of humanity's defiance. The stage was set for a deadly chase into the unknown, with the lives of 6 forgotten girls hanging in the balance. The battered freighter shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, the swirling vortex collapsing behind them to reveal the haphazard sprawl of Arcadia Station. Nolan exhaled heavily, his white-knuckled grip on the control yoke relaxing fractionally. They'd made it. Barely. "Ezra, hail the station master and request emergency docking clearance," Nolan ordered, his voice tight. "Liam, prep the medbay. These girls won't survive much longer without proper care." As the crew scrambled to carry out his commands, Nolan risked a glance back at their precious cargo. The 6 Jem'Hadar children lay strapped onto makeshift bunks, their emaciated bodies swallowed by salvaged blankets. Juno, the little warrior who'd first reached out to him, shivered beneath her covers, eyelids fluttering restlessly. Nolan's heart clenched. They had to live. He'd torn across the stars and invited the wrath of an empire to pluck these innocent souls from the jaws of oblivion. Failure was unacceptable. Arcadia Station traffic control crackled over the comm, jerking Nolan back to the present. "Freighter Valkyrie, you are cleared for docking at Bay 94. Welcome to the ass end of the universe." Nolan's hands danced over the controls, guiding the Valkyrie into the station's cavernous docking bay with practiced ease. The instant the magnetic clamps locked onto the hull, he was out of his chair and racing towards the cargo hold. Liam was already there, barking orders as Ezra and the other crewmen hastily assembled stretchers from scavenged parts. Together, they eased each skeletal child onto a makeshift bed and whisked them out of the ship, a solemn procession of desperate hope. The station's medical facility was a far cry from the gleaming hospitals of Earth, but to Nolan it might as well have been a 5-star resort. At least, here the girls had a fighting chance. He watched as Liam and the station's doctor transferred their patients onto sterile beds, wordlessly cataloging each jutting rib and sunken cheek. Rage burbled in his gut. What kind of society, he wondered, could so callously discard its own children? Even in humanity's darkest moments, such cruelty was unthinkable. And yet the Jem'Hadar ascendancy, in its ruthless pursuit of absolute order, had institutionalized the abuse and neglect of its most vulnerable. The very thought made Nolan want to put his fist through a wall. Hours ticked by as Liam and the station doctor worked frantically to stabilize their critical patients. Nolan paced the narrow confines of the medbay like a caged animal, his nerves fraying with every beep of the archaic life support machines. When Juno first stirred, it was so subtle that Nolan nearly missed it, but then her eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused, and she let out a pitiful moan. In an instant, Nolan was at her bedside, one weathered hand engulfing her tiny palm. "Easy there, kiddo," he murmured, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You're safe now. I've got you." Juno blinked slowly, her gaze gradually sharpening as she took in her alien surroundings. Nolan watched confusion, then fear, then primal panic flicker across her gaunt features. She jerked upright, wild eyes darting for an escape route. "Juno, it's okay," Nolan soothed, tightening his grip on her hand. "You're not in danger anymore. No one's going to hurt you here." But the girl was beyond reason, adrenaline temporarily overriding her weakened state. She thrashed against Nolan's hold, bony limbs flailing in a desperate bid for freedom. The biomonitors screeched in warning as Juno catapulted off the bed, ripping out lines and sensors in her frenzied escape. Nolan lunged after her, snagging the back of her medical gown a heartbeat before she reached the door. Juno fought him like a cornered wildcat, fists and feet pummeling his arms and chest with surprising force. But Nolan just wrapped her tighter in his embrace, absorbing her blows without a word. "I've got you," he whispered into her matted hair over and over again. "I've got you, Juno. You're safe." Slowly, infinitesimally, the fight began to drain out of her. Great gulping sobs replaced frantic strikes as Juno went limp in Nolan's arms, her slight weight sagging against his chest. He held her through the storm, murmuring wordless reassurances into the crown of her head. For a long moment they just stood there, the weathered captain and the broken girl, two souls from different worlds united by the unbreakable bonds of shared trauma and fierce, defiant love. Nolan knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he would burn the ascendancy to ash before he let them lay a finger on Juno or her sisters again. But first, they had to survive. As Juno's sobs gradually eased into shuddering sniffles, Nolan scooped her into his arms and carried her back to the bed. Liam reattached the biomonitors with practiced efficiency, mouth set in a grim line. "She's stable for now," he pronounced, "but we need to get her and the others to a real hospital, with specialists who know how to handle long-term starvation cases. They're not out of the woods yet." Nolan scrubbed a hand over his face, feeling every one of his 48 years. "I know," he said quietly, "but we can't risk taking them back to Coalition space until we're sure the ascendancy isn't still on our tail. We need to lay low, just for a little while." Liam looked like he wanted to argue, but a warning glance from Nolan quelled any protests. They both knew the stakes. One wrong move, one errant transmission, and the Gem Hadar would descend on Arcadia Station like the wrath of an angry god. And this time, there would be no escape. Nolan looked down at Juno's slack face, her tear-streaked cheeks and cracked lips a testament to the hell she'd endured. A sudden swell of protectiveness, fierce and primal, rose in his chest. He'd risked everything to pull these girls from the brink of death, and he knew, without a flicker of doubt, that he'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Their path forward was strewn with danger, a treacherous gauntlet of hostile forces and unforgiving void. But as Nolan watched the faint rise and fall of Juno's chest beneath the sterile sheets, he felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. They were still alive, and as long as he had breath in his body, Nolan swore he would keep them that way, no matter where their journey took them next. The acrid stench of scorched metal and ozone hung heavy in Arcadia Station's cavernous docking bay. Nolan's boots clanged against the deck plating as he strode towards the Valkyrie's gangway, his mind focused in unyielding commitment. The girls were finally stable enough to move, but every second they lingered increased the risk of discovery. "Captain!" Ezra's urgent shout cut through the din of preparations. "We've got company!" Nolan whirled, hand instinctively dropping to the blaster at his hip. A towering figure strode through the bay's main entrance, flanked by a phalanx of heavily armed mercenaries. The newcomer's scarred Gem Hadar features twisted into a predatory grin as he locked eyes with Nolan. "Captain Parker," the behemoth rumbled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "I am Craxagan. You have something that doesn't belong to you." Nolan's fingers tightened on his weapon, but he kept it holstered. For now. "These children aren't property, Craxagan. They're under my protection now." The bounty hunter's laugh was utterly devoid of mirth. Such noble sentiment, but the Ascendancy doesn't see it that way. Hand over the girls and I'll let your crew walk away with their miserable lives. "Not gonna happen," Nolan growled, his crew forming a protective cordon around him. The air crackled with tension as both sides reached for their weapons. Just as the first shot seemed inevitable, a small voice rang out from behind Nolan. "Wait!" Juno stumbled down the gangway, her sisters close behind. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but her chin was raised in defiance. We'll go with you. Just don't hurt them. Please." Nolan felt his heart constrict. "Juno, no." But the girl silenced him with a look of fierce persistence that belied her frail frame. "They risked everything for us," she said softly. "We can't let them die." A muscle in Craxagan's jaw twitched, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. But before he could respond, Nolan stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the bounty hunter and the girls. "Like hell," he snarled. "You want them? You go through us first." The words had barely left his mouth when chaos erupted. Blaster fire filled the air, acrid smoke billowing as both sides dove for cover. Nolan tackled Juno to the ground, shielding her with his body as energy bolts screamed overhead. "Ezra!" he bellowed over the cacophony. "Get the girls back on the ship!" His first mate nodded grimly, herding the terrified children up the gangway as Nolan and the rest of the crew laid down suppressing fire. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but the tight confines of the docking bay worked to their advantage, funneling Craxagan's mercenaries into brutal choke points. Nolan's world narrowed to the rhythmic thud of his blaster and the burning in his lungs as acrid smoke filled the air. He lost track of time, aware only of the desperate need to keep the bounty hunters at bay long enough for his people to get to safety. A sudden explosion rocked the bay, nearly throwing Nolan off his feet. Through the haze, he saw Ezra sprinting back towards their lines, a feral grin splitting his soot-streaked face. "Couldn't let them follow us, Captain," the first mate panted. "Their engines are scrapped now." Nolan allowed himself a grim smile. It was the opening they needed. "Fall back," he roared. "Everyone on board now!" They retreated in stages, covering each other's withdrawal until the entire crew was safely ensconced within the Valkyrie's battered hull. As the gangway retracted, Nolan caught a final glimpse of Craxagan's face, twisted with impotent rage. "This isn't over, Parker," the bounty hunter bellowed. "I'll hunt you to the edge of the galaxy if I have to." Nolan said nothing, slamming his palm on the airlock controls. He sprinted for the bridge, barking orders as he went. "Get us out of here now!" But as the engines whined to life, an alarm klaxon cut through the ship. Liam's voice crackled over the intercom, thick with worry. "Captain, we've got problems. That firefight did a number on our starboard stabilizers. We're not going anywhere fast." Nolan's mind raced. They couldn't stay here, but limping off into space was tantamount to suicide. His eyes fell on a battered freighter docked across the bay, its hull scarred but sturdy. "Ezra," he said slowly, "isn't that Mara Krell's ship?" His first mate's eyebrows shot up. "You can't be serious, Captain. Last I heard, she'd sooner space you than look at you." Nolan's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "Then let's hope she's in a charitable mood today, because right now she might be our only shot at getting these kids to safety." As Ezra moved to hail the other ship, Nolan felt a small hand slip into his own. He looked down to see Juno staring up at him, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and something that might have been hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for us." Nolan squeezed her hand gently. "Always, kiddo, always." The comm crackled to life, and a familiar voice filled the bridge. "Well, well," drawled Mara Krell. "Nolan Parker. I'd ask what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into this time, but I think I can guess." Nolan took a deep breath. Their future hung on what he said next. Mara, I need your help. Help! Nolan's voice cracked, the weight of their predicament evident in every syllable. A beat of silence stretched across the comm channel before Mara's sardonic chuckle filled the air. You always did know how to make an entrance, Parker. All right, bring your sorry excuse for a ship alongside. We'll tow you out of here. Relief flooded through Nolan as he turned to Ezra. You heard the lady. Get us docked and ready for tow. As the Valkyrie limped towards Mara's freighter, Nolan felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Juno, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Are we safe now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nolan knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. We're not out of the woods yet, kiddo, but we've got friends helping us now. That's a start. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as both crews worked to secure the ships and plot a course away from Arcadia Station. Nolan paced the bridge, barking orders and coordinating with Mara's team. As they made their first jump, the stars outside the view screen blurred into streaks of light. Nolan allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They'd escaped Craxhagen, but the real challenge was just beginning. Days bled into weeks as the two ships wound their way through a labyrinth of unstable wormholes and derelict mining fields. Each jump frayed Nolan's nerves further, the constant threat of Jem'Hadar pursuit hanging over them like a shroud. During a stop at a remote asteroid outpost for repairs, Nolan noticed Juno hovering near a group of engineers working on the Valkyrie's damaged stabilizers. Her eyes gleamed with undisguised fascination as she watched their precise movements. Interested in how it all works? Nolan asked, approaching her. Juno nodded, not taking her eyes off the intricate machinery. It's beautiful, she breathed, like a living thing. Before Nolan could respond, Mara's gruff voice cut through the din. You've got a good eye, kid. Want to learn how to keep this bucket of bolts flying? Juno's face lit up, a spark of genuine excitement breaking through her usual guarded expression. Can I? Mara's lips quirked in a rare smile. Come on then, let's see what you've got. As the days wore on, Nolan watched with growing amazement as Juno blossomed under Mara's tutelage. The girl's fingers flew over control panels with increasing confidence, her mind seeming to grasp complex engineering concepts as easily as breathing. Meanwhile, the other girls began to emerge from their shells, drawn out by the patient encouragement of Nolan's crew. Ezra's animated retellings of human myths and legends soon had them clustered around him in the mess hall, hanging on his every word. Dr. Finnegan's gentle guidance helped the girls navigate the turbulent waters of their emotions. Nolan often found them in quiet corners of the ship, eyes closed in meditation, their faces slowly losing the haunted look that had become all too familiar. As they neared the final transfer station before Coalition space, Nolan's comm crackled to life. The intercepted Jem'Hadar transmission chilled him to the bone. Radicals responsible for the theft of Ascendancy property. The fugitives are to be considered extremely dangerous. Lethal force is authorized to recover the stolen subjects. Nolan's lips pursed as he turned to Ezra. Get Colonel Hogan on the line. We need to move up our rendezvous. Hours later, as they approached the transfer station, klaxons blared to life. Mara's voice cut through the chaos. Parker, we've got company. Nolan's heart sank as he saw the familiar silhouette of Craxhagen's ship emerging from the station's shadow. All hands! Battle stations! He roared. The docking bay erupted into a maelstrom of blaster fire as Craxhagen's mercenaries poured from their ship. Nolan ducked behind a cargo container, returning fire as he shouted into his comm. Hogan, where the hell are you? Pinned down in Bay 4, came the colonel's strained reply. We can't reach you. Nolan's mind raced, searching for a way out of this death trap. A familiar voice crackled over his headset, steady despite the chaos. Captain, I can get us out of here. It was Juno. What are you talking about? Nolan demanded. The station's power grid, Juno explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. If I can access the main junction, I can trigger an overload. It'll give us the distraction we need. Nolan hesitated for a split second before nodding grimly. Do it. Ezra, cover her. As Juno darted towards the power conduits, Nolan redoubled his efforts to hold off Craxagon's forces. The air crackled with energy as blaster bolts flew in every direction. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. A heartbeat later, a thunderous boom shook the station as emergency klaxons wailed to life. "Now," Nolan bellowed, "everyone to Hogan's ship!" They fought their way through the smoke and confusion, half-dragging wounded comrades as they went. Nolan's lungs burned as he sprinted up the gangway, Juno's hand clasped tightly in his own. As the ship's engines roared to life, Nolan caught a final glimpse of Craxagon through the closing airlock. The bounty hunter's face was a mask of impotent rage as he howled a promise that sent ice through Nolan's veins. "This isn't over, Parker. I'll hunt you to the edge of the universe if I have to." The airlock slammed shut, cutting off the bounty hunter's fury. Nolan sagged against the bulkhead, his heart pounding as the ship lurched into hyperspace. They'd made it, for now. But as the adrenaline faded, Nolan knew their ordeal was just the beginning. They'd escaped one battlefield only to plunge headlong into another, the treacherous waters of interstellar politics. As Hogan's ship streaked towards Coalition space, Nolan looked down at Juno. The girl's face was streaked with soot, but her eyes shone with a newfound perseverance. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Nolan squeezed her shoulder, offering what reassurance he could. "Now, we fight a different kind of battle, but whatever comes next, we face it together." The moment they crossed into Coalition space, Nolan's comm lit up with urgent messages. He grimaced as he scrolled through the flood of notifications, each one adding to the growing knot in his stomach. "Looks like we've stirred up a real hornet's nest," he muttered, glancing at Ezra. His first mate nodded grimly. Jem'Hadar Ascendancy's already filed an extradition request. They're calling it an abduction. Before Nolan could respond, Colonel Hogan strode onto the bridge, his face a mask of carefully controlled tension. "We've got a welcoming committee," he announced, "and not the friendly kind." As they approached the rendezvous coordinates, a sleek Coalition patrol ship materialized out of the inky void. Its running lights pulsed an ominous red, leaving no doubt as to the nature of their reception. "This is Coalition Enforcement Vessel Aegis," a stern voice crackled over the comm. "Prepare to be boarded for inspection and detainment of suspected fugitives." Nolan's face hardened as he exchanged glances with Hogan. They'd known this was coming, but the reality of it still stung. "Understood, Aegis," Hogan replied, his voice steady. "We'll comply fully." As the boarding party swarmed through the airlock, Nolan found himself face to face with a stern-faced woman in an immaculate Coalition uniform. Her resolute expression swept over the assembled crew before settling on the huddled group of Jem'Hadar girls. "I am Commander Reeves," she announced crisply. "By order of the Coalition Security Council, these minors are to be placed in protective custody pending resolution of their legal status." Juno stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "We're not going anywhere without Captain Parker and the others." Reeves' expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I understand your concerns, young lady, but I assure you, this is for your own protection while the situation is dedicationed." As the girls were escorted away, Nolan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Mara, her eyes blazing with a familiar fire. "We're not letting this go without a fight," she growled. Nolan nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Damn straight we're not." The next weeks passed in a blur of legal depositions, media ambushes, and clandestine meetings. Nolan found himself thrust into a world of labyrinthine bureaucracy and cutthroat politics that made his old smuggling days seem quaint by comparison. They gained an unexpected ally in Adriana Voss, a firebrand human rights lawyer who took on their case with a passion that bordered on obsession. Nolan watched in awe as she tore through the Ascendancy's legal arguments with minimal resistance, her voice rising to a crescendo in the cavernous Coalition hearing chambers. "The evidence is incontrovertible," Voss declared, her eyes flashing as she gestured to the holographic displays. "These children were subjected to systemic abuse, neglect, and exploitation. To return them to such conditions would be nothing short of a moral abomination." Outside the courtroom, public opinion swayed like a pendulum. Nolan's crew found themselves alternately hailed as heroes and vilified as criminals. They moved between safe houses, always one step ahead of the paparazzi drones and Jem'Hadar agitators that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Through it all, Juno and her sisters became the unexpected face of the movement. Their testimony, broadcast across 100 worlds, laid bare the brutal realities of life as an unclanned Jem'Hadar. Nolan's heart swelled with pride as he watched Juno address the tribunal, her voice steady despite the weight of 100 camera drones tracking her every move. "We're not just numbers," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of alien faces. "We're people. We have dreams, hopes, and we deserve the chance to live them." As the legal battle raged on, whispers began to circulate of growing unrest within Jem'Hadar space. Underground resistance movements, emboldened by the public scrutiny, began to push back against the ascendancy's iron grip. Nolan was poring over the latest intelligence reports when Ezra burst into their makeshift war room, his face ashen. "Captain, we've got a problem," he panted. "It's Crax Agan. He's been spotted in Coalition space." Nolan's blood ran cold. He knew the bounty hunter wouldn't have given up so easily. And now, with the stakes higher than ever, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to silence the girls once and for all. As alarms began to blare throughout the station, Nolan's mind raced. They'd come too far to lose everything now. Whatever Crax Agan had planned, they'd be ready for him. The real fight, it seemed, was only just beginning. The station shuddered as another explosion rocked its superstructure. Nolan sprinted down the corridor, his heart pounding in his ears. Alarms blared, their urgent wails punctuated by the staccato bursts of weapons fire. "Ezra, what's your status?" he barked into his comm. Static crackled for a moment before his first mate's voice came through, strained and breathless. "We've got multiple breaches on levels 3 through 7. It's Crax Agan's people, no doubt about it." Nolan cursed under his breath. He should have known the bounty hunter wouldn't give up so easily. "What about the girls?" "Security's trying to evacuate them, but—" Ezra's words were cut off by a thunderous boom. "Shit! They've breached the inner perimeter!" Nolan rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a group of panicked station personnel. He shoved past them, his mind racing. He had to get to the girls before Crax Agan did. The security hub was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Monitors flickered with scenes of destruction as mercenaries in unmarked armor fought their way through the station's defenses. Commander Reeves stood at the center of the storm, barking orders to her overwhelmed staff. "Where are they?" Nolan demanded, grabbing her arm. Reeves' face was grim. "We lost contact with their security detail 5 minutes ago. Last known location was Habitation Block C." Nolan's blood ran cold. That was on the other side of the station, right where the heaviest fighting was concentrated. He turned to go, but Reeves caught his sleeve. "Parker, wait, you can't just—" Her words were drowned out by a deafening explosion. The entire room shook, sending equipment and people sprawling. As the dust settled, a nightmarish scene unfolded on the main view screen. Crax Agan stood in the wreckage of what had been a secure airlock. Behind him, 3 of his mercenaries held struggling forms at gunpoint. Nolan's heart sank as he recognized Juno and 2 of her sisters. "No," he whispered, watching helplessly as the bounty hunter dragged his captives towards a waiting shuttle. Reeves was already mobilizing a response team, but Nolan knew they'd never make it in time. He sprinted for the door, shouting into his comm, "Mara, Ezra, meet me at Docking Bay 12, now!" The next hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation and tense strategy sessions. By the time they were ready to launch, Crax Agan's ship had long since disappeared into the depths of space. As the Valkyrie's engines hummed to life, Nolan stared out at the star-flecked void. He'd failed them once. He wouldn't do it again. "Hold on, Juno," he murmured. "We're coming." The ship streaked into hyperspace, carrying them towards a confrontation Nolan knew might be their last. The Valkyrie dropped out of hyperspace with a bone-jarring shudder. Nolan gripped the command console, his eyes fixed on the swirling nebula ahead. Somewhere in that cosmic maelstrom lay Crax Agan's mercenary outpost. "Any sign of them?" he asked, voice tight. Ezra's fingers flew over the sensor array. Negative, Captain, but there's a lot of interference from... Wait. He leaned forward, brow furrowed. I'm picking up a faint distress signal. It's them. Nolan's heart raced as he punched in the coordinates. The Valkyrie surged forward, plunging into the nebula's roiling clouds. Visibility dropped to near zero as streams of ionized gas buffeted the hull. Multiple contacts, Mara shouted from the weapons station. Cracks Agon's got a whole damn fleet out here. Nolan's mind raced. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but giving up wasn't an option. Ezra, full power to shields, he ordered. Mara, target their engines. We're going in hot. The next minutes were a blur of chaos and precision. The Valkyrie danced through a hail of enemy fire, Nolan's piloting keeping them one step ahead of destruction. Mara's shots found their marks with surgical accuracy, crippling mercenary ships left and right. As they neared the source of the distress signal, a massive structure loomed out of the nebula, Cracks Agon's hidden base. Nolan's breath caught in his throat as he saw three small figures being herded towards a waiting shuttle. There, he shouted. Mara, take out that shuttle. Ezra, prep the tractor beam. The Valkyrie's main guns roared to life, vaporizing the shuttle in a brilliant explosion. In the confusion that followed, Nolan brought the ship alongside the base's docking bay. The tractor beam locked on, yanking Juno and her sisters to safety. As they fled the nebula, pursued by the remnants of Craxagan's fleet, Nolan allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They'd pulled it off, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The girls' rescue became a rallying cry. Footage of the daring operation, captured by the Valkyrie's external cameras, spread like wildfire across the coalition and beyond. Public opinion shifted dramatically, with calls for justice echoing through the halls of power. Adriana Voss seized the moment, orchestrating a media blitz that thrust Juno and her sisters into the spotlight. Their harrowing stories of life as unclanned Jem'Hadar captivated billions. On Alreda, a neutral world chosen for its symbolic bridge between cultures, Nolan watched with pride as Juno took the stage at the first human Jem'Hadar summit. Her voice, once timid, now rang out with conviction. We stand before you not as victims, but as living proof that change is possible, she declared, her gaze sweeping across the assembly of diplomats and dignitaries. The cruelty we endured must end, not just for us, but for all children trapped in systems of oppression. As she spoke, Nolan saw hardened Jem'Hadar faces soften, human skeptics nod in agreement. The girl's testimony, backed by the mountain of evidence he and his crew had gathered, was undeniable. The summit stretched on for days, marked by heated debates and tense negotiations. But as news of uprisings across Jem'Hadar space filtered in, even the staunchest traditionalists began to waver. In a historic moment broadcast live across both civilizations, the Ascendancy's chief negotiator stepped forward. In light of recent events, he intoned, and in the spirit of forging a new path, we hereby grant these children dual citizenship and full legal protections under both human and Jem'Hadar law. The chamber erupted in cheers and applause. Nolan swept Juno into a fierce hug, his heart swelling with a mixture of joy and bittersweet pride. She'd grown so much, become a symbol of hope for millions. But he knew her journey was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, as the dust settled and the true magnitude of their victory became clear, Nolan found himself restless. The fate of Juno and her sisters was secure, but what about the countless other unclanned children still suffering? The idea came to him in the middle of the night, fully formed and impossible to ignore. By morning, he was already outlining his vision to a bemused Colonel Hogan. An interspecies orphanage? Hogan repeated, eyebrows raised. Aboard a carrier? Nolan nodded, his excitement building. Think about it. A neutral space beyond the reach of any one government, a place where kids from all backgrounds can learn, grow, and understand each other. Hogan stroked his chin, a slow smile spreading across his face. It's crazy, he admitted, but just crazy enough to work. With Hogan's connections and Adriana's legal expertise, the pieces began to fall into place. A decommissioned coalition carrier was secured, its vast hangar bays reimagined as living spaces and classrooms. Nolan dubbed it the Dawnlight Academy. As the first wave of rescued children arrived, human, Jem'Hadar, and a dozen other species, Nolan watched Juno effortlessly step into her role as mentor and big sister. She moved among the newcomers with grace and empathy, offering the same comfort and guidance she'd once received. Standing on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars, Nolan felt a profound sense of purpose. The Dawnlight was more than just a haven for the lost and forgotten. It was a crucible for a new generation, one that would forge bonds across the divisions that had kept their civilizations apart for so long. As he turned to join Juno in welcoming the latest arrivals, Nolan knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. The Dawnlight Academy became a beacon of hope, drawing orphans from across the galaxy to its halls. Years passed, and Nolan watched with pride as Juno blossomed into a confident young woman. At 21, she stood before a packed auditorium on New Terra, her memoirs projected behind her as she addressed the rapt audience. "We were forged in darkness," Juno said, her voice steady and clear. "But through the compassion of strangers, we found our light." The crowd erupted in applause. Nolan beamed from his seat in the front row, marveling at how far they'd come. But even as Juno's message spread, tensions within the Jem'Hadar ascendancy reached a boiling point. Nolan's comm chirped urgently, Colonel Hogan's face appearing on the small screen. "It's happening, Parker," Hogan said grimly. "Full-scale civil war has broken out on the Jem'Hadar homeworld." Within days, Nolan found himself aboard a coalition peacekeeping vessel, hurtling towards the heart of the conflict. Juno insisted on joining the mission, her skills as a cultural liaison proving invaluable. The reality on the ground was chaos. Nolan and Juno moved through rubble-strewn streets, delivering medical supplies to overwhelmed field hospitals. The air was thick with smoke and the constant thrum of distant explosions. "We need to get these to Dr. Finnegan's team," Juno said, hefting a crate of nano-regenerators. "They're running low on—" Her words were cut off by a deafening roar. Nolan's world exploded into white-hot pain as the shockwave slammed him to the ground. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard screams. Children's screams. Acting on instinct, Nolan threw himself over the small bodies huddled nearby. He felt Juno's presence beside him, shielding as many as she could. When consciousness returned, Nolan found himself in a dimly lit cavern. The acrid smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he blinked away the fog. Dr. Finnegan's worried face swam into view. "Easy there, Captain," the doctor murmured. "You've taken quite a hit." Nolan tried to sit up, but searing pain lanced through his body. "Juno!" he gasped. "Where's Juno?" Finnegan's expression tightened. "She's in critical condition. We're doing everything we can, but—" Nolan's world narrowed to a pinpoint of fear. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not after everything they'd been through. Mara appeared at his bedside, her face etched with commitment. "I have a way to save them both," she said, holding up a vial of shimmering liquid. "But it's untested, experimental." Nolan nodded weakly. "Do it," he whispered. The next hours passed in a haze of pain and fevered dreams. Nolan drifted in and out of consciousness, catching glimpses of worried faces and hearing snatches of urgent conversation. When he finally clawed his way back to full awareness, the first thing he saw was Juno's radiant smile. "Welcome back, old man," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Nolan reached out, clasping her hand tightly. "What happened?" Juno's smile faltered. "You almost died. I told them to save you first, even if it meant—" Understanding dawned. Nolan pulled her into a fierce embrace, ignoring the protests of his battered body. No words were needed. The depth of their bond transcended language. As they recovered, news of Juno's actions spread like wildfire. The image of a human and Jem'Hadar risking everything for each other became a rallying cry for moderates on both sides. Weeks later, Juno stood before a gathering of human and Jem'Hadar leaders, her voice ringing out with passionate conviction. "We have seen the cost of hatred," she declared. "Now let us embrace the power of unity." Nolan watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride. As Juno's words wove a tapestry of hope and reconciliation, he knew that their journey, improbable as it had once seemed, was a long way to go. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in generations, it held the promise of true peace. The Dawnlight Academy's observation deck teemed with activity as Juno Vareth, now 28, gazed out at the stars. Behind her, a cacophony of languages filled the air, human children laughing with young Jem'Hadar, Andorian orphans sharing meals with Tellarite refugees. It was a symphony of hope, one that still filled her with wonder even after all these years. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Captain Nolan Parker's voice cut through her reverie. She turned, smiling at the man who had become more than a mentor, a father in all but blood. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real," Juno admitted, "from where we started to this." Nolan nodded, his eyes crinkling with pride. "And now we're off to see the fruits of our labor spread even further. The shuttle's prepped and ready for our diplomatic trip to the colonies." Hours later, they stood in the newly christened Castler Youth Center. It mirrored Dawnlight in miniature, a haven of inclusivity on a world once defined by rigid caste hierarchies. As they toured the facility, a small voice caught Juno's attention. "Excuse me, are you really her, Juno Vareth?" Juno turned to see a young, unclanned girl, no more than 12, staring up at her with a mixture of awe and desperation. "I am," Juno said gently. "What's your name?" "Kihara," the girl whispered. She glanced around nervously before continuing. "Please, I need your help. There are others like me, trapped. The market, it's not gone. Not really." Nolan's face hardened as Juno knelt to Kihara's level. "Tell us everything," she urged. What followed was a harrowing tale of corruption and cruelty. Despite new laws and reforms, a shadow network of hardline ascendancy officials still peddled in misery, targeting the most vulnerable. Kihara's words painted a picture of a resurgent trafficking ring spanning impoverished outer worlds, a cancer eating away at the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to build. "We need to act," Juno said, her voice steel. "Now." Nolan nodded grimly. "I'll contact Hogan. We'll need resources, clearances, and a damn good plan." The next weeks passed in a blur of covert operations and clandestine meetings. Juno found herself in dingy spaceport bars, eavesdropping on conversations in a dozen dialects. Nolan pulled strings with old coalition contacts, building a web of intelligence. They traced encrypted transmissions, followed money trails that led to shadowy shell corporations. Each new piece of the puzzle revealed the staggering scope of the syndicate's operations. But it was on a derelict station in unclaimed space that they finally hit pay dirt. "There," Ezra muttered, enhancing a grainy security feed. "That's our hub, and those energy signatures, that's got to be where they're keeping the kids." Juno's fist clenched as she studied the layout. Dozens of life signs huddled in what had once been a cargo bay. Kihara was in there somewhere, along with countless others who'd never known a moment of true freedom. "We go in hard and fast," Nolan said, outlining the assault plan. "Strike teams here and here. Juno, you'll lead the main push to secure the prisoners." The battle, when it came, was chaos incarnate. Juno moved through smoke-filled corridors, her team a lethal dance of human and Jem'Hadar precision. They encountered fierce resistance. The slavers knew what capture meant. In the command center, Juno found herself face-to-face with the syndicate's leader. The Jem'Hadar soldiers sneered, all arrogance and hate. "You're a disgrace to your kind," he spat, unclanned filth playing at being a hero. Juno's response was swift and decisive. A series of strikes left the man disarmed and on his knees. As she snapped restraints around his wrists, she leaned in close. "I am exactly what my kind can be," she whispered, "when we're free to choose our own path." With the prisoners rescued and the base secured, Juno found Kihara amidst the sea of shell-shocked faces. The girl's eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and newfound purpose. "I want to help," Kihara said firmly. "Like you helped me. There are more out there who need us." Juno nodded, an idea taking shape. "Then let's make sure they have someone watching out for them." In the months that followed, the Dawnlight Academy gained a new wing. The Watchers, Juno called them, a network of searchers and rescuers, many former victims themselves. They deployed sensor arrays across lawless sectors, ready to swoop in at the first hint of trafficking activity. As Juno watched the team of watchers prepare for their latest mission, she felt Nolan's presence beside her. "You've built something incredible here," he said softly. Juno shook her head. "We built it, all of us, and we're just getting started." Juno's comm unit chirped urgently, cutting through the hum of activity on the Dawnlight's bridge. Colonel Hogan's weathered face appeared on the screen, his expression grim. "We've got a situation, Vareth. Multiple watcher teams have gone dark in the past 48 hours. Juno's stomach clenched. "How many?" "7, all in different sectors." She turned to Nolan, who was already pulling up a tactical display. Red markers bloomed across the star map, each one representing a lost team. "This isn't random," Nolan muttered, his eyes narrowing. "There's a pattern here." As they pored over the data, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The missing teams had all been tracking leads on rescued children who had vanished again. But these weren't isolated incidents of local corruption or desperate families. "It's organized," Juno breathed, cold realization settling in her gut. "Someone's targeting our people specifically." Ezra's fingers flew across his console, decrypting files recovered from their last raid. "I've got something. Encrypted communiques, references to a group called the Purists." The name sent a chill through the room. As Ezra dug deeper, the full scope of the Purists' agenda unfolded before them. Fanatical devotion to the old caste system, experiments on non-Jem'Hadar DNA, a bioweapon that could rewrite the very fabric of their hard-won peace. "We need to move fast," Nolan said, his fist tight. "If they perfect this weapon—" "They won't," Juno cut him off, her voice steel. "We'll stop them." Days blurred into weeks as they chased leads across the sector. Each new discovery painted a darker picture. The Purists had infiltrated deeper than anyone had imagined, their tendrils reaching into the highest echelons of what remained of the old ascendancy. It was on a desolate moon outpost that they finally cornered one of the Purists' top scientists. As Coalition Marines secured the perimeter, Juno and Mara Krell made their way to the heart of the facility. The lab was a nightmare of twisted metal and pulsing biomatter. And there, hunched over a console, was a face Mara had hoped never to see again. "Kalen," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man who turned was barely recognizable as the bright-eyed boy who had once roamed the halls of Dawnlight. Kalen Krell's face was a mask of hatred, his eyes burning with zealous fire. "Hello, Mother," he spat. "Come to see what true purity looks like?" Juno's hand tightened on her weapon, but Mara held up a restraining arm. "Kalen, please, this isn't you. What happened to the boy who wanted to heal people?" Kalen's laugh was a harsh, brittle thing. "He died with Father and Aaliyah. In the war you and your pet humans brought down upon us." As Mara pleaded with her son, Juno's eyes darted around the lab. A canister on a nearby table pulsed with sickly green light. The bioweapon, nearly complete. "It's over, Kalen," Juno said, stepping forward. "Your network is exposed. Your cells are being raided as we speak. Stand down, and we can still help you." For a moment, something flickered in Kalen's eyes. A ghost of the boy he once was. Then his face hardened, and he slammed his hand down on a nearby console. Alarms blared. A computerized voice announced the activation of a self-destruct sequence. "If I can't remake the world," Kalen snarled, "then I'll take you with me into oblivion." Chaos erupted. Marines shouted for evacuation. Mara lunged for her son, and Juno, driven by instinct, dove for the bioweapon canister. In the instant before the world exploded into light and heat, Juno saw Mara tackle Kalen, saw the look of anguish and love on her face as she held her lost boy one last time. Then fire consumed everything.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.